The lotus of the true Dharma represents a Buddhist tendency that calls itself Mahayana, apparently signifying the Great Course, but later traditionally interpreted to mean the Great Vehicle. To oversimplify, this movement distinguished itself from the older schools to which it referred derisively as Hinayana, the defective course or vehicle, in two respects. First, it boasted that its practitioners were aiming at the salvation not merely of themselves, but of all animate beings as well. Second, it concerned itself with the universal and the absolute, though these meant different things to different schools within that movement. This is not to say by any means that these two features were totally absent from the earlier schools. Virtually all features of the Mahayana can be found in germ in the earlier forms of Buddhism. What this does seem to mean is that by the time the Mahayana made its appearance as such, the older and established forms of Buddhism were divided into discrete schools, each having its own written canon. It must be stressed that the written canon in Buddhism is sectarian from the outset, and that pre-sectarian Buddhism must be deduced from the writings as they now exist. In other words, the fledgling Mahayanists are trying to have their doctrines and their uncanonized text accepted as the good coin of Buddhism by a Buddhist community accustomed to a very different fare. To proceed with the conjecture, each one of the Mahayana scriptures, at least of the early ones, appears to have been presenting itself as a self-contained rival to the entire Tripitaka, the alleged sermons of the Buddha concerning doctrine and monastic conduct, and the earliest systemizations of doctrines by his disciples, then as now a corpus of considerable scope. Now, once a certain Mahayana Sutra gained standing in the Indian Buddhist community, authors of minor works, even adherents of lateral schools, would wish to endow the respective minor works with greater dignity by simply tacking them onto works of established repute. There is, it certainly seems, unmistakable evidence of this in the Lotus. There is a further complication. The Lotus, like all the Buddhist scriptures, presumably was not written down until long after it had gained general currency. By the time it was written down, ruling out the accretions just mentioned, it consisted of two self-evident layers, the older in verse, the younger in prose. Thus, the oldest layer in the Lotus is presumably one of verse. Even there, however, there may be two separate scriptures, one saying that there is only one path to salvation, not three, the other saying that the Buddha is not to be delimited in time or space, nor indeed in any finite terms. To this oldest layer, in other words, to both scriptures, which by this time seem to have been united in one text, now a sacred text in mixed prose and verse, are added several smaller scriptures, the older ones, if I am not mistaken, in mixed prose and verse, the younger ones in prose alone. These accretions end with the remark that the assembled listeners, overjoyed, saluted the Buddha and took their leave. Apart from the above-mentioned accretions, to which no space will be devoted in the present treatment, the Lotus, as it has just been seen, makes two essential points. The former being that the Buddha is not to be delimited in time or space. The latter being that the attainment of Buddhahood is the only form of salvation, the only thing worthy to be called by the name nirvana. Let us now have a somewhat closer look at these two ideas. The earlier schools imagined Gautama Buddha to be but one in a series of Buddhas, each of whom would pursue a career similar in certain key respects. He would be born a prince, have experience that would turn him away from the world and the flesh, try extreme asceticism and find it wanting, have an intuitive experience that would explain everything to him, reveal the content of that experience to others, then experience, quote, extinction, that is, a death followed by no reincarnation. When the Mahayana became full-blown, it declared this to be but one of three Buddha bodies. The first was the body of transformation, or Nirmanakaya. The second, in ascending order, was the body of bliss, or Sambhogakaya, a guise in which the Buddha was visible to bodhisattvas, that is, to advanced candidates for Buddhahood. The highest was the Dharma body, or Dharmakaya, to which no predications can possibly apply. In the Lotus, the Buddha tells his listeners, by resort to the most exaggerated hyperbole, that his person is, in effect, superior to both time and space. This, in short, a statement that the only real Buddha body is the Dharma body. On the oldest layer, the word Buddha, or awakened, appears to have denoted one who had himself experienced the beatific truth, and to have connoted one that turned about to reveal that truth to others. As the monastic community proceeded to produce a series of clerics concerned with their own enlightenment to the exclusion of the spiritual well-being of anyone else, the Mahayana, motivated by other considerations as well, made its appearance. It characterized the course of religious practice just mentioned with the pejorative designation Hinayana, the deficient course, deficient in the sense that it conduced to the salvation of no one other than the practitioner himself. To it was counterposed the Mahayana, the great course, great because it sought nothing less than the salvation of all animate beings. Thus there were two sets of practitioners, both acknowledged by the Mahayana to be legitimate. The Bodhisattva, one whose essence is enlightened intuition, whose aim is to be a Buddha, and who, in the very process of becoming one, converts and saves untold living beings, and the Shravaka, or auditor, whose aim is to be an Arhat, or worthy one, able one on the face of it, that is, one who achieves his own salvation alone. To these two is added a third, the Sanskrit form of which is Pratyeka Buddha. On the face of it, this would mean individually awakened, that is, having attained to enlightenment by his own efforts, not by listening to the preachings of a Buddha. While this is true of him, the important fact is that his enlightenment comes from observing the pattern of interdependent development, or, to oversimplify, of cause and condition, or pratyaya. By the time the Lotus makes its appearance, the saints are a trio. Bodhisattva, aiming at the salvation of self and others. Pratyeka Buddha, aiming at the salvation of self by his own efforts. And Shravaka, aiming at arhatship, that is, the salvation of self by listening to a Buddha and taking his sermons to heart. All legitimate from the Mahayana point of view. The Lotus says, no, the second and third do not exist. The only form of salvation is Buddhahood. The ostensible Pratyeka Buddhas and Shravakas are either bodhisattvas putting on a show or bodhisattvas deceiving themselves. Why, even the Arhat is not real.